Now, for more on this, I spoke to David Cortright. He's an Associate Director of Programs and Policy Studies at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies. He told me this.
Well, it's basically a United Nations process. UN peacekeeping is organized through the Security Council and through the UN General Assembly. So if there's a conflict, for example, in the Congo, DRC, the UN Security Council has passed lots of resolutions to try to prevent the conflict, and they decide to bring in a security force, a UN peacekeeping force. Then they establish the parameters as to how many troops are needed. Then it goes to the General Assembly as they figure out which countries should be contributing troops to it. The requests go out to countries to provide the troops. And then there's a financial assessment, which is built up around a complicated formula. But basically, the wealthiest nations, the nations that are part of the Security Council, are requested to pay the largest amount of money for paying for these peacekeeping troops.
So it sounds to me a big part of it is that the personnel that's involved. What about the infrastructure? What about moving assets, whether it's planes or tanks or trucks or medical equipment? How is that calculated?
There's a whole headquarters established at the United Nations, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and it's like a military command operations center. And then they call upon the various member states to provide the resources. So the ground troops tend to come from nations in the global south, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, several African states. A lot of the equipment then comes from the global north states, the wealthier states, Japan, the US, some of the European countries. And it all comes together through the Department of Peacekeeping and is deployed into the field in the Congo or Somalia or the different places where peacekeeping operations are now in place.
Absolutely fascinating how that gets divided up in terms of the money and resources. The latest numbers that we have is that the annual budget is roughly $7 billion. That, of course, as you said, is shared among the different countries. My question is that enough money? And if not, how much really would be enough?
Well, the fact is that on every single one of these peacekeeping missions, the Security Council sets a target that so many thousand troops would be necessary to really address the conflict. And in every case, they have difficulty getting that number of troops. Sometimes they eventually get it after a number of years, but it takes too long and the numbers of forces are inadequate. And for years, people have been arguing that there needs to be a much greater capacity at the United Nations to address these peacekeeping needs. There's been talk about establishing a kind of a standby peacekeeping force, where a number of nations would have these troops more readily available to be deployed quickly. When there's a crisis, when there's real conflict, when civilian populations are endangered, you need to get the security forces there quickly. But peacekeeping operations often take months, sometimes even years, before they can be adequately staffed.
Well, I mean, I was going to bring that up. I mean, you already brought it up, and that is in decades past, these sort of developments took a long time to develop. It took a long time for solutions to be in place. But these days, things happen so quickly with the advent of social media and the speed of news, if you will. You say that needs to be more of a faster response method. What's the one change that you would likely make to that, and who's opposed to this?
Well, I think you see a lot of nations are opposed to it. It would cost more. You might have to double the budget. You know, it's about $7 billion this year. It might have to go up to 14 or 15 billion. But, you know, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what nations are spending on wars. You think about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and what they cost, the incredible, horrific cost of the war in Syria. So these costs are minimal. And there also needs to be then a political commitment on the part of the nations of the Security Council primarily, but elsewhere, to have in place a standby force that would be some tens of thousands of troops who would be maintained in their separate countries in Nepal or Bangladesh or wherever, but could be very quickly deployed on a few days, even a couple of weeks' notice, to be in the field when necessary to address emergencies that are inevitably coming up for security around the world.